I am Soledad Quiroz. I am Vice President of Policy of INGSA, and I was part of the Latin American chapter a couple of years ago, and I'm going to be moderating this last panel on transformations. So welcome everybody to our closing plenary panel on the conference first day. This is a panel that I've been particularly excited about, not only because the topic is central to our work, and indeed soon, if not already, an aspect of all our lives, but also because it allows me to talk some wise and dynamic people who have been thinking and doing a lot about it. We are going to discuss societal transformations, the large-scale, multi-sector, multi-level changes to our socio-ecological and socio-technical systems that a new reality of climate change and our digital world, for instance, are presenting to us, to all of us around the world. The aim of this session is to explore how the context, structures, and practices of science advice for policymaking are evolving to help societies address large-scale and, importantly, systemic transformations. What I mean by this is the move from addressing very specific policy problems towards considering broader and more complex system change as the major challenges humanity faces. So I'll start by introducing our very esteemed panel. Ambassador Macharia Kamui. He is a Kenya diplomat and former representative to the United Nations. He is one of the architects of the SDGs. Dr. Andrea Hingwood, Chief Scientist of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. Professor Terence Forrester, he's Chief Scientist for Solutions for Developing Countries Program at University of West Indies. Professor Charlotte Watts, who is at the other end. She is Chief Scientific Advisor and Director of Research and Evidence at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And finally, Ms. Eva Lilian Ujenesa. Thank you for joining us. She is the co-chair of the Rwanda Young Academy. So please, a round of applause for our panel. Okay, this is better for me. So these big challenges are common for the whole world. And I think that is one distinctive lesson that I have learned in this conference. It doesn't really matter where are you from. Most of the problems we have are like our colleague from INGSA Africa said, they are all going back to people. You can have a lot of money, you can have a lot of education, you can have a lot of resources, but somehow problems between people trying to understand each other and to collaborate are at the center of many of these challenges. Ambassador Macharia, sorry. I would like to start with you because you were instrumental in the design of the SDGs. And so could you tell us how this, or how you came up with this more systemic and holistic approach to problems that are very complicated and were addressed in a very specific and separated manner. How did you get to change that conversation to a more systemic way to try to solve the problems?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
That's better.
Thank you very much, Soledad. First of all, thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to be having this conversation. Moderators sometimes do throw you a little bit off by asking questions that you thought were going to be slightly different, but I'm actually glad that you've picked the question about the SDGs. It's a great entree for me. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the SDGs and the 2030 agenda was not supposed to succeed.
Okay.
It wasn't supposed to happen. And the reason was quite simple, is that business as usual and the status quo had become so embedded, and so many people are invested in the way in which business had been done for 70-odd years at the United Nations, that nobody really wanted to do anything fundamentally different. Which is why I have such great respect for this organization and for this title that they've picked, the transformative imperative. I actually don't know whether everybody truly appreciates just how significantly important that is. When we were undertaking the work, and it took us 3 years, you can imagine, of negotiations, with 193 countries and over 250,000 civil society organizations. Did I say 50,000? 2,500 civil society organizations. When we were doing that work, one of the things that we realized is that there was a desperate need for a shift in the way in which we were doing business as a multilateral system globally, but also as how we related and how we aspired. Universality and transformation were the key calling cards for the SDGs. Universality and transformation. Until then, the United Nations was seen as part of the global ODS system. Global problems of biodiversity, climate change, environment, hunger, and so on were seen as problems of the global south. The global south was seen as the needy, the global north as the great provider. And we had to bring an end to that for reasons that are now obvious to everybody, about climate change, about biodiversity, loss, about everything that we now consider to be part of the SDG package. And because everyone is embedded in the status quo, including all of you, and because governments are embedded in the status quo, and because civil society is embedded in the status quo, surprisingly enough, because civil society for most part tends to be funded either by big pharma or by big industry or by governments who are already embedded in the status quo. Therefore, change becomes an incredibly difficult thing. Incredibly difficult. And when you talk about the transformative imperative, what you're first of all doing is signaling to everybody that what we want is a radical shift and change in how we do business. Because clearly, business as usual has not been delivering the right outcomes, or else we wouldn't be here. Science is marginalized. Science. I was in a session today, I think it was Professor from Rwanda who reminded us of the contribution of science to the American experience, the superpower that we see today. 84% of that contribution came from science and technology, I think you said. Phenomenal. And yet you have countries today that have no budgetary allocations to science and technology. It's a phenomenal thing when you think about it. So we need to identify and mobilize progressive elements, as we did when we were doing the SDGs. We needed to identify and promote progressive ideas that attracted the progressive elements to join those of us who wanted a transformative framework for global development. We needed to identify and promote progressive partners. And we needed all of us to galvanize all our energies and to recognize that we were going to be under siege at all times. So here we are trying to undertake a transformative imperative, trying to restructure how science is seen either by governments or by other entities who are the gatekeepers of global resources. And we need to ask ourselves, what are the transformative inputs that we're going to have to put in place to get this done? So I'll quickly give you a sense of Africa. Here we are, a continent with 1.3 billion, 18% of the global population, yet we have 60% of the arable land in the world, and over 500 million Africans go hungry every day, for one reason or another. Why? Because of the status quo. We have a continent with 30% of global minerals. We have been part of all the revolutions, industrial and otherwise, that have taken place on this planet. And we're now on the 4th industrial revolution. And within 200 miles of Kigali, give or take, is all the minerals that the world needs for driving the 4th industrial revolution. This is hugely significant. Is Africa going to be missed out of the 4th industrial revolution like it was missed out of the first 3? This is the question for science and scientists and for policymakers who are enabling science to drive development on our continent. It's a huge challenge. When we talk about the transformative imperative, we need to ask ourselves exactly what are we talking about and where is it going to take us. So for me, the SDGs have laid the groundwork. The framework is in place. It's a universal framework, north, south, east, west. All of us are in it together. There is poverty in all our countries, not just on this continent. There is hunger in, if not all, virtually most of the world's countries. It might be very small, it might be very large, but it's there. And these are challenges for all countries that they need to resolve. And I believe that if we're going to really embrace the transformative imperative, we must ask ourselves what it is that we need to do differently, how we need to upend the system of science, how we need to recognize the limits of governments. African governments, pretty much all they do is divvy up the budget and the money of the country. That's all they do. There's no other resources for anything else. So when you see the politics of our countries in Africa, there are politics about budgets and money. And it's about money that's available to the country, which is usually minuscule. So the question is, are we barking up the wrong tree when we keep saying we want to see African governments driving science and they have to fund science? The target was 1% in 2007 for all African countries, 1% of their budget. Till today, no African country, not even South Africa and Egypt, which are the most progressive in this regard, has reached 1% of their budget on science. The African average is 0.4. 0.04 today. So How realistic? How are we going to upend the system? How are we going to transform our engagement with governments if it is really governments that are going to deliver? And if it's industry, industry in Africa is retail industry. Most of the goods come from external sources. They are not part of an industrial chain. This is fundamentally problematic for African countries. Why should they invest in R&D? Someone was talking about that in the room next door. Why? When they're focused just on profits, which can only be made by exploiting current structures, the status quo of business in Africa. So we have a challenge, and I don't want to go on any longer, but we need to understand, and I think we need to appreciate, that unless we recognize that the scientists of this continent, and in fact the scientists of the world, have to begin to work together so that the north-south divide is broken, so that cooperation between science in the north and science in the south becomes seamless, just like science in the north is seamless between themselves and among themselves. That's why Nobel laureates tend to come from different countries. It's because they share science. We need to go to a point where we are sharing science and sharing research and development with Africans. It is the responsibility of scientists in the north to see to it that they too become partners with African scientists in ways in which we can transform our reality on this continent. So I'll stop there, and I hope I was provocative enough.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Professor Watts, you work in an international environment and thinking about collaboration between countries. What is, do you think, the ambassador had a good challenge for you in the collaboration between Global North and different countries and different scientists to continue addressing these big issues?
So firstly, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for asking me a completely different question than I'd expected, but that's absolutely fine. And I completely agree with you. And I really like the title of this session, which is around the imperative that we somehow figure out how to achieve transformative outcomes. You know, we need collective leadership and mobilization, and that includes scientific expertise, research and innovation to accelerate progress on the SDGs, but it's things like enabling countries not only to grow industries that create jobs and wealth, but how do you do that in a clean way? How can you use science and technology to leapfrog polluting technologies? How do we use innovations to support greater resilience to the impacts that are already locked in on climate change, which will disproportionately hit this continent and the most poorest of the world? So the imperative of that is really, really strong. Your question of how to achieve that macro level change as a scientist isn't one that I can answer in all the pieces. You're probably better placed to do that. But for me, as a scientist working in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, you know, when we're talking about science diplomacy and science advice, a lot of the way it's framed is kind of like, oh, how do you advise a minister on a particular policy question? Or for me, it might be linked to a particular policy business case or, you know, piece of investment. But actually, a lot of my work and the work that our department does is really how do we work collectively in partnership, and that's including working with the multilateral system, with working with major meetings such as COP, for example. You know, at COP, how do you get the science coming out from the detailed analysis to really illustrate the significance and breadth of impacts that we're going to expect at different temperature changes? but also the significance of the opportunity and what we can do to really tackle that. So at COP26, for example, we had quite a lot of debate and focus on the science of solutions, because we felt that the balance between really raising the red flag and saying how bad this really is, with actually there's something we can do and we need to do that urgently, was essentially part of the science diplomatic effort, working with scientists all around the world who are advising their respective delegations of this is the urgency, we need to act, we need to find agreement, but also there are things that we can do, and science and tech and innovation are part of it. But also where there are gaps, where we don't know, or where there are issues that should be on the agenda. So for example, at COP26, we brought in the major issue about adaptation and resilience, because the focus had been really on mitigation, and the risk of mitigation is then it ignores the devastating impacts that are going to happen, and it risks diverting resource in one direction versus saying we need to create new funds, new resources, and generate more evidence around adaptation and resilience, and particularly in support of the Global South, but also in all of our respective countries. So there is a sort of multilateral engagement that actually in the world of science advice and diplomacy is really important for us. Or you were saying, the other point you made, Ambassador, was how do we share knowledge? How do we support collaboration? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, another multilateral forum that we've been heavily involved in is G20. So India was chairing the last G20, where they had a roundtable of chief scientists and science advice networks, bodies across G20 countries. And the kind of issues there we were pushing on was issues around equity and inclusion in science. How do we get not only great minds, but the diversity of great minds, because clearly that's what we need to make progress on some of these challenges. We were also pushing on how do we tackle the issue and lack of access to scientific information around the world. We have this huge disparity, and we have a system of publication that essentially means you have to pay to access. So those G20 conversations were about, can we change those fundamental building blocks so that scientists all around the world, including countries like Rwanda, can access the latest information without having to pay disproportionate fees, and also publish without having to pay disproportionate fees. And there it was interesting, because in COVID that happened. And the publishing houses didn't go bust. When there was an urgency, we managed to do it. And if you look at the pressures we have now, there are all urgencies of different paces of burning, but somehow we aren't thinking about what can we do with the same, thinking about the same pressure as COVID, to say, how do we change things so at least at a minimum, scientists around the world can access the latest thinking and collaborate. I think the other element in our diplomacy is increasingly how much we are working in partnership around the world. What we know is greatest progress is when there's collaboration. Science grows the pot. It's not one where, and particularly when we're thinking about global challenges, where we should be trying to say, no, we own this problem ourselves. We can solve it because of the brilliance of our own scientists in our own countries. But sometimes there's a risk in debates that that's the assumption, because we all talk about our brilliant scientists. It can lead to the misconception that that's actually how we're going to solve these problems. But we all know, if you're a scientist, you know it's not like that, right? So a big part of our role in our engagement is how do we support those collaborations? And we, in the ways of our working, we'll have bilateral agreements. We say, how do we, bilaterally between many, many countries, think about what are our shared priorities? Where can we work together? Where there are opportunities of collaboration? What is the opportunity you see in working with us, and what is the opportunity we see? Similarly, and also we have those conversations with the private sector as well. And increasingly, often in diplomacy, you'd be talking about conversations between nation states, but increasingly in our role, we're thinking of working and talking to international tech players, also innovators at all different levels. And in our research investments, often we are trying to support local grassroots innovators, but also partnering with big different types of industry say, are there opportunities by working together where we can create change? So for example, GSMA, the mobile phone operators, for example, are a partner we work with very closely, and through them, we're able to support a range of innovations through our research funding that can reach multiple countries, that draw on the sort of opportunities of digital, but also the sort of innovation skills that they have. And then lastly, the last point, when you think about transformational change, and I'm just going to take it back home to the UK, where similarly we're saying, how do we transform our economy? How do we respond to the threats of climate change? So for example, I'm going to get the year wrong. In 2019, the UK committed to achieving net zero by 2050. Now, if you look at actually the logistics of that, we have a department that leads on achieving net zero and energy security, but actually to get that trajectory on track, we have to have what is transport doing, what is industry doing, what is our treasury doing, what are the policy environments for investments, what is health doing, what is agriculture doing, and so on. And so we've had to, in that case, in the UK, we have chief scientists in every government department. What we have had to do is come together, working with our government scientists, to say, how do we all say, what's the collective analysis, where are the new innovations that we need, the research gaps, what does the data say, to help our country plan for a transformation. And again, it takes you outside your own departmental structure to having a much wider systems level conversation, which hopefully will enable us to meet the targets we've set.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dr. Hingwood, you also work in the international arena with this very complicated issues. I hope I make a question as surprising as the other two. Can you share with us how the strategies of the UN are applying more to this system thinking and this complex and very wide thinking and designing approaches for the long term of the challenges?
Okay, so I should just throw my papers on the ground as well, because that's not quite where I was going to start. But in the UN system, I think many of you will be aware of the Quintet of Change, and importantly, the requirements in the UN now for all UN entities to engage in data and digital uplift, in strategic foresight, in the behavioural sciences, etc. And I think the attempt with those exercises is actually to bring together disparate disciplines so that we can actually make good integrated decisions. And I have to go back to the SDGs because we're not doing so well. I think I can say that quite clearly. And the environmental dimension is really pretty poor. But the great thing about the SDGs, and actually some of the goals we have, is that we have stretch targets. We actually have the goals. We simply need to work out the how. And I want to talk about the third leg of the SDGs, which is the environmental dimension. If we start to think about decarbonisation and digital transformation, all requirements under our UN system and required, digitalisation and the massive increase in AI is driving huge demand for critical minerals and metals, rare earths, etc. That demand has huge environmental implications for energy, water, biodiversity, for populations who are already being exposed to contaminants in areas where legislation is not actually managing them appropriately. So what do we do as some scientists? We go, terrific, let's go and mine the deep sea floor, or we're going to put spacecraft up in space. That's not transformation. That's the sustainability paradox, where we're actually continuing to do the same things. We've just bolted on a different solution. So I think what the Secretary General, and with the attempt to join up the UN, to actually look at our UN country teams, to actually ensure across portfolios, across the different agencies, all of whom have chief scientists and scientific organisations, is actually to join up the information and to actually look at surprises and innovative solutions. And I'm going to take you right back to a really local example, because I think it was Adeline this morning who talked about storytelling. So in my past life, I had to give advice to government on expansion of an iron ore mine. And so I was sitting there doing stakeholder engagement, as you're required to do in that process. And this gentleman came in the room, and his neck was bulging, and he was so angry. Anyway, he couldn't communicate effectively because he was so angry. Everyone else had just dismissed him. Anyway, he walked out the room. I thought he was going to go out and get a gun and shoot us all. Anyway, he comes back in the room. What was so interesting is that this gentleman, his home had been damaged from the charges that were being put in the mine. But he actually was an expert in explosives. And what happened through that meeting was that he started to talk about what the solution was. Guess what? We went back, checked it out. We actually had a solution. For me, your ability to engage with disparate voices, with different disciplines, enables you to actually consider solutions that might not be in the environment portfolio. So maybe when we look at smart cities, instead of putting images up of how fast our cars are going to go, that it's all going to be streamlined, we're going to use less efficiency, etc., we're using more minerals and metals, and maybe we should be designing for livability, for walkability, for access to services, health, education, to actually improve equality and housing, which if we were really serious about livability, we would be able to do that across all countries and actually address some of the environmental dimension of the SDGs. And so I think from a transformation point of view, from where we sit within UNEP and within the UN system, it is about our ability to combine the different disciplines and actually disciplines that we're not familiar with. I'm not an economist. I hate the economy. But, I know, but we have to embrace the economics. Why, when we go and promote clean cars in a particular country, and the scientists said, right, we're going to improve the health of people in this location because we're going to have much more energy efficient cars, and we're going to have clean fuels, the engine design's good, and we won't have as much pollution. Except they were cheap cars and they were marketed as being cheap. The population didn't want to buy cheap cars. Why is it when we try and put new gas into the homes of people who are using wood heaters, they don't want to use the gas because the food doesn't taste as good? So I think both at the global, at the regional, national, subnational and local level, if we are able to actually come together, and we do have the tools now with data, information and knowledge, and we actually start listening to each other about what the solutions might be, and it may not be a high-tech solution. We might actually be going back in time and find a low-tech solution that's actually going to provide a very good outcome for our communities, because after all, we are trying to look at prosperity of people and planet. And I think that, you know, in terms of transformation, if we're serious, we as scientists who normally come from a particular discipline also need to recognise that we have our blind sides, and therefore we need to engage these processes. And just as a last thing, from the foresight point of view and your ability to anticipate what's coming down the road, we have gone out and done a global environmental foresight exercise. And many of the issues that have been identified are those that you would not consider an environment agency would even start to think about. But when you start to see them listed, and you start to see the impact they may well have on the environment, of course we need to be engaging in these anticipatory tools. We need to actually be putting all of this data and information together and collectively come together for solutions. So I don't know whether I answered the question, or certainly not what I wrote here. Anyway, thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I told the panelists I wanted to hear their personal experiences, and I think I'm getting that in a way that is looking at this transformative imperative, which is, like I said at the beginning, very wide, very big issue. So Professor Forrester, how do you, as a chief scientist of a small island state, seize this huge transformative imperative, and how do you approach it from your local perspective?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm going to build actually on what my colleagues have said, and paradoxically I don't have to throw away my sheets, I can use them. So it's really important to frame remarks both within the perspective of think global and think and act local. And also to use the two tools interchangeably. Abstraction at a very high level to frame things, but at the same time, storytelling is really critical to bring it home to people that you can actually internalize it. So I'm going to go flip back and forth. And so in a cricket analogy, I'm going to do a long run-up before I deliver, so bear with me. So we know very well the complexities that are inherent in what we have to do to systematically progress 17 SDGs, going beyond business as usual, and accelerating at the same time to achieve goals in time. When you consider, when you read, what I come away with is the staggering complexity of a global program management system, which is difficult, to say the least. Today, what I'm going to attempt to do is really to use an idiosyncratic approach to highlight the need for really practical actions, still sitting within this acceleration mandate in order to assure progress. So framing all the way down to acting where the rubber meets the road. Yes, there are myriad imperatives to achieve just, equitable, sustainable development across all different jurisdictions in our countries and our regions. And it requires systems thinking, and it requires embedding that systems thinking where it should be in this complex ecosystem where there's a dyadic relationship between humans and the environment that we live and work in. At the same time, the storytelling line, I'm going to pitch it as if we're speaking as a simple doctor, comfortable with dealing practical problems patient by patient, while at the same time being really very aware that patients exist in complex, health-influencing environments that operate both temporal and spatial domains. And lastly, my perspective is from a small island developing state that is both small, poor, and to add a third one, vulnerable. So how to provide science advice to governments within that context to approach SDGs as a reasonable set of targets, scaling up and transforming. First of all, contextualize. Yes, we require solutions for wicked problems. And when I think of wicked problems, I kind of playfully add wicked and dreadful problems from Bob Marley, where capabilities and capacities to provide valid solutions are really incomplete, as they are in lots of small, poor countries, maybe 70, 80% of the world. And they do not exist to scale. So let's customize and let's tell a story. So Jamaica is excellent at several things. One of them is using democratic tools and practices to work towards just and equitable outcomes, even when the setting is one where there is persistent inequality and significant inequity. And so whatever science advice comes to policymakers needs to have embedded in it some robustness and inclusiveness and fitness for purpose. The threats in many small island developing states, and I heard my colleague from South Pacific, are real enough. So within the context of climate change and sea level rise, 80% of built infrastructure and economic activity lies on a thin coastal strip around Jamaica. And so the advice needs to also support immediate, because it's already begun, as well as long-term action. And within this, not only is the science capacity small relative to need, but the economy is small and heavily dependent on a few domains especially tourism, which is itself very climate sensitive. So let's customize further and say, well, you know, within this complexity, government of Jamaica has a host of busy politicians. They're always running flat out, but they're always out of breath and yet really in need of advice to make correct choices in a complex and dynamic scenario. So one tool that would be useful is to have an in-country facility to perform the quantitative analyses of our own complex ecosystem using a systems thinking approach to support a suite of options with a risk and reward dashboard associated with it. But these skills do not exist in Jamaica. So what do we do? And it says, duh, collaborate. Yes? So collaborate with partners. However, currently it's not obvious, for example, that a facility, service facility exists to provide a service where one can roll up with petabytes or zettabytes of data and be able to sit and iterate with appropriate experts towards a customized analytical output that's useful in the context that the problem exists. So to accelerate, I'm going to propose, but going back to 30,000 feet, that we would need, as others have highlighted, to develop really functional platforms in this STI ecosystem that facilitate really functional, practical collaboration. So this is a particular practical problem I've used to illustrate this set of all practical problems needing simultaneous solution in order to power integrated investments for global sustainable development. So high level and rubber meeting the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have to leave. Would you like to say some words before you are leaving, or?
My sister, I must apologize. I have a plane to catch.
No problem.
I wasn't going to say anything, but only to say that I really believe that if the network that is here can begin to find ways of working much more intimately among itself and with all its partners, if we on this continent can find ways as scientists to collaborate better and to break the barriers of borders and language and all these other things, and if we can begin to resource ourselves differently so that there isn't all these very short-term monies that disappear in the middle of our research and in the middle of our development, that I think we can break this challenge that we've been facing with science driving the change that we need on our continent. And I think the proposals that were made by the professor over there for Jamaica would work just as well for our continent in very many ways. And just to make a pitch for my friends at the International Science Council, because they have already set up the global call for missions, which I think is the beginnings of driving our scientists to collaborate better and targeting real outcomes for the SDGs. And I think we need to find a way here at this conference to interrogate the usefulness of these missions that have been proposed by the Council, especially among Africans. I think they hold great promise, and we should look at ways to seize those missions to move forward. So I apologize again, my sister. I really do have to. I'm already late. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Have safe travels. Okay. Now we go to our last panelist. No, I didn't forget about you. Your perspective is a little bit different from the rest of the panel. You are starting your career as a scientist, and you have to face these huge problems, global problems. So how does it look for you as a young scientist to see there's a lot to do for science? How are you prepared for that?
Thank you so much, moderator. So my name is Eva Liliane. I'm a lecturer at the Rwandan Institute for Conservation Agriculture, and I'm here as the co-chair for the Rwanda Young Academy and a member of the Rwanda Association for Women in Science and Engineering. So I'm going to follow up on one of the speakers this morning, starting with a small story. So my first experience with science advice was during COVID-19. Here in Rwanda, we have a task force for COVID-19, and I was privileged to be part of it at the time as a mathematician modeler. And it was a very great experience to sit in a room. So we used to, have days to sit together with people from different disciplines and get to have discussions about, whatever issue that's being handed out to us at that moment. And whatever you would be thinking as a mathematician, as someone from another field, you would get feedback right away from someone in a different field. And that was very interesting to me because it kind of helped us a little bit fine-tune a little bit of the mathematical modeling that you wanted to do, but also be able to get feedback quite fast in terms of the accuracy of the things you want to do, whether the advice you wanted to give are actually even relevant for the policymakers in the room, or whether they're actually even useful with people in art and human sciences being in the room as well. So that was a very great experience. And it's something that whenever I talk to my fellow members of the Rwanda Young Academy of Science and other AI career scientists that I know, I realize that that's not something that is common, right? So we do not really have this kind of platform where, as an area career researcher, you could get to interact directly with policymakers to make sure that the research you're doing is actually going to be that useful, that you're not working in silo, you're not working alone. And again, echoing to what some of the members of the panel were saying, we do need such platform where we could conduct transdisciplinary research, but also be able to work with people from different fields on some of these very complex issues that sometimes you don't realize how complex it is or how many layers it has by not having that discussion with other people. So as a researcher, again, in climate change and also working at the age of agriculture, one of the issues that we have realized at RICA is also that it's one thing to be able to do good research locally and be able to provide advice that you think is useful for the government. It's a completely different thing to have the capacity to be able to look at all the different layers in terms of, for example, of economy, etc., of whatever policy you want to suggest. And to be more specific, I want to talk about conservation agriculture, which again goes with climate change and food security. So this is an issue that's very at core of the things that we do at my institution. But we have realized that it's very difficult to be able to convince the end user, which is the smallholder farmer, to use whatever method you think you're telling them is good for them in long term, when you cannot show to them right away that they will have an increase in yield, which is what they need at the moment as the end user. So my idea and my advice in terms of transformation, especially for scientific advice, is to make sure that first we create that platform, not just for early career researchers to be able to have a conversation with policymakers, being both on the national levels but also international etc., but also to make sure that we equip early career researchers with the tools to actually be able to provide good advice. And what I want to say here is, for example, if I think some countries have been good at doing that. In South Africa, they do have a lot of programs, for example, for scientific advice. But when we have a huge task force of scientists that are not necessarily trained to be able to write policy brief, to be able to know how to actually engage with policymakers on this hot topic, and to be able to convey in simple terms or, to tell them what's going to be the impact of the research they're currently doing in a few years, then we end up having some of the issues that, that were mentioned in a previous panel for AI, where you end up having sometimes the policymakers calling the scientists being, we have this issue A, B, C, D, what do we do now? And the response will be, oh, you know, we have warned you a few years back that this is going to happen. So sometimes it's about that disconnection between the scientists and the policymakers that makes us lose these opportunities. And one of the things that we are doing at the Rwanda Young Academy of Science and some of the other organizations I mentioned is to try to see how do we train the actual scientists that we have today at hand in our country? How do we train people to be able to have this conversation with policymakers? And we hope to be able, you know, throughout this conversation over the next 2 days and also later on, once the INGSA Rwanda hub is going to be up and operational, to have that platform to get information about, you know, the emerging issue, what is the hot topics that we should be thinking about in whatever research and disciplines we're in, but also to have that platform to be able to say, okay, now, listen, this is what I'm doing, this is how it's going to affect the country or the continent, and be able to give that feedback to the policymakers. So I'm going to stop from here for now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eva. So we don't have enough time for all the other questions I had prepared. But I would like to ask you if, is there some reaction to what the other panelists said, or is there something you would like to point out that maybe you were expecting to respond? Professor Watts?
No, I mean, I just have really enjoyed actually the comments from and reflections from everybody here. I think it's been quite rich in terms of the contrast, but also a lot of the similarities in many respects. But really that challenge of how you go from local to global, and can we really think about how we make those connections and synergies work, so we aren't essentially reinventing the wheel, but effectively really learning from each other, and the sorts of, as we all grapple and try and make progress on these really complicated issues. And I mean, I suppose the only additional point I would say is the UK has launched its white paper on development, which is our vision of how we want to work in development, and that includes a core focus around patient equitable partnerships and the importance of partnerships, the importance of science and tech, the importance of mobilizing far more resource into development, many other areas, but that core element of how do we work differently, and very much glided by the Global South and their priorities, but bringing our breadth of expertise to bear and recognizing that we're in this in the long term together.
Thank you.
Well, I just support the platforms for sharing, and we have the tools. I mean, look at the amazing tools that we now have at our disposal, where we have data and information and knowledge, and our ability to share it is incredible. Our ability to analyze it, but actually it's making it appropriate and relevant and accessible where it needs to be used, which means that local to global has to be considered more seriously. But I have to say, from the environmental perspective, and we started out with the SDGs, if we don't consider the third pillar up front with our decision making, we're actually not going to solve our problems. And two, maybe many of those solutions to environmental issues, when they are discussed in the context of finance, economics, health, etc., maybe will provide solutions to problems that we're not seeing now. And I think that's one of the things through the processes we've just been with our global environmental foresight process with the International Science Council, is actually maybe that third pillar might well solve a lot of the problems we've got. But we do need to join up, and we need to be inter and multidisciplinary in our action. And I'm looking forward to it. I actually think it's achievable.
Thank you. Professor Forrester?
I wanted to extend that and to make, it's not an advertisement, but I'm going to speak as a representative of ISC, and point out, as Peter would point out, that it's an organization that is global, with academies and unions that are situated globally through their memberships. And more recently, over the last 2 years, the appointment of over 200 fellows, or very high-level scientists and people who work with science, very well plugged in. And so, I would moot without any authority that this resource could be brought into the discussion about how do we customize locally, because that's incredibly important, while leveraging the tools.
Thank you very much, Hiba.
I really like what you just said. I think it's a great way for us to move forward, and I think it would be a great opportunity to do that. One thing I want to add that I did not get a chance to mention earlier is that as we think in terms of the transformative narrative, we need to also think, I think, ahead a few years and think about education. And here I want to go back to say, we all know in the next few years, the youth in Africa is going to basically be the workers of the world. So we need to keep in mind, how do we start thinking today about those few years, not just about the issues we're seeing today, but what about that next generation that we want to actually be bringing up and forward so that they can actually be useful and be able to drive this transformative narrative throughout not just Africa, but throughout the world. So I think this is something we need to think about, not just as African, but I think globally in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, every one of you. It's, like I said, it's very interesting when we talk about our problems, our shared problems. Solutions are much more similar. There's a lot we can contribute to each other. It doesn't matter if we're on the other side of the world, if we speak a very different language, if our culture is so different. We are facing the same problems, and collaboration is the way to go. We now have to work on how to collaborate better within our big world. So thank you very much, everyone.